I was a baller. And I'd set this crazy goal of being in 50 countries. And then I'd also set this goal that I didn't share with the staff that I wanted to be on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine. In hindsight, these goals were just so ego driven.
Welcome to the Legacy Branding Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Beauparlant, here to guide you through the journey of selling your business and building a personal brand that leaves a lasting impact. On the show, we'll explore real-life founder stories, expert insights, and actionable strategies to help you navigate the transition, avoid post-sale crisis, and create your impact-driven legacy brand. Whether you're thinking of selling, building to sell, or already on the other side, this podcast is your go-to resource for making your next evolution your best one yet. Let's dive in. Today, I'm super excited to welcome Mike Brcic. He is a serial entrepreneur and global adventurer who helps entrepreneurs live more connected and fulfilling lives through his company, Wayfinders. After building and exiting North America's largest mountain biking adventure company, Sacred Rides, Mike now leads transformative adventures in some of the world's most remote and stunning locations. And on these trips, you get deep connections to yourself, to a community, to the world, and to your truth and full alignment. And having personally experienced 3 of these, which many people have heard me talk about, these epic adventures, and I've signed up for another one next year, I can attest to how perfectly aligned Wayfinders is with Mike's mission and his passion. So welcome, Mike.
Hello, Laura. Nice to connect.
I know. I feel like we talk all the time. So this is a more official conversation. So I'm excited to dive into this conversation because, I'm a big fan. I tell a lot of people about Wayfinders and seeing the way that you run your business and live in alignment with, the legacy that you want to create for yourself. This is called the Legacy Branding Podcast. So of course there'll be that tie-in. I would love to first dive in and ask what inspired you to create Wayfinders after selling Sacred Rides, and how long did that transition take you?
Yeah, there was actually an overlap there of about a year and a half. And so my first event company was called Mastermind Adventures originally, was in September of 2017. And I sold Sacred Rides in February of 2019. So there was about a year and a half there. I was doing both. I had more or less handed off the company to my staff to run because I was, I'd passed the 20-year mark at that point. I was a little bit burnt out. Love the company, but then I made the silly mistake of just really trying to put my foot on the gas for many years and just bringing on investors and hiring and expanding, whatever. And I took this beautiful lifestyle business and I turned it into this big unwieldy beast and spent less and less time on my mountain bike and more time writing shareholder reports and all this other kind of stuff. Anyway, side note.
I'm sure that's a common problem I'm sure many entrepreneurs listening will go, yep. 100%.
Yeah. And so to answer your actual question, as I was growing the company, I was finding myself pushed out of my zone of knowledge. As the company was growing, I kept encountering newer and bigger problems and finally got over my own hubris that I was God's gift to entrepreneurship and knew everything there was to possibly know, and realized that I needed to surround myself by other smart people, ideally smarter people than me, who had done the things that I was trying to do. And so I joined some groups like EO. I started attending different conferences and I got a lot of value from these events, but I found them very heavy on information. There's lots of speakers, lots of workshops. This was all great stuff. I learned a lot from it, but really the value I was getting from these events was in the connections that I made with other entrepreneurs. They weren't really set up ideally for that. I had to really work in the hallway or over a meal or a coffee break to try and make those connections. My experience with my previous company was, or at the time, my current company was Sacred Rides, was that when you take people outside and you're doing fun and challenging things together, they tend to bond very quickly. And you can attest to that, right? Like sometimes the harder the challenge, the deeper the bond, because you're going through a shared experience of hardship. You're supporting each other in that journey, and that brings people together. And so I wanted to create something where connection was first and foremost. And so I just put together a 5-day event in the Canadian Rockies, and we were mostly mountain biking, a little bit of hiking, but also time for, peer sharing. We had some sessions after dinner talking about different topics, sessions in the hot tub. And it was really just meant to be a one-off, just test it out. It sold out super quickly and people asked me to do more. And that was the seed. And that was the germination of the idea. And I just discovered I really love this. And I didn't really love the previous company so much anymore. It had kind of grown up into an adult and it was time for that child to go out into the world. And so I eventually sold that company. And so I could focus on this full time.
How did it feel, that first event for you, right? So you've been working in Sacred Rides, you're burnt out, you're not feels good, but it was kind of that one-off. So was there something that you felt
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, it felt amazing. Part of it was I was bringing, so the event took place, it's called Island Lake Lodge Cat Skiing, and it's this beautiful lodge. It's actually several lodges up in the mountains outside of Fernie, British Columbia, where I lived for many years after university. And it had become a little bit of a spiritual home. Like I just loved being in the mountains. There's 800-year-old cedar trees there. It's a really magical, special place. And I just love being able to show people this place. And I loved seeing people just connecting over dinner, over the hot, picking each other up when they're like scattered all over the mountain bike trail or whatever that may be. And I just loved it. And that was, as you know, I really love surprises. And I tend to
Yes.
keep my itineraries completely opaque. People show up in Greenland or Morocco or these places you've been. They don't really know what's going to happen. They just get a packing list and just show up. And my first event wasn't quite like that. There was an itinerary, but on the last day, we had a really grueling bike ride in the morning up this big hill, and then we had lunch. And people were a little bit gassed from this big climb in the morning. And I told them after lunch, I said, we're going to do another big climb, but trust me, it's going to be worth it. It's a really amazing bike ride. And there's lots of grumbling, like, oh my God, I can't do another big climb again. And so we set out after lunch and we climbed up this back road, and we were only climbing for 5 minutes. And I said, P break, let's just turn off here. And then we turned the corner, and there were a couple of helicopters waiting for us. And anyway, long story short, the helicopters took us up to the top of this mountain, and it was just this incredible heli bike descent down there, and just seeing like
Oh,
people's
wow.
faces. And it made me realize, like, if I had told people about these helicopters, they would have been excited and it would be awesome, we're going in helicopters. But just springing it on them like that, like the look on people's faces was like, oh, amazing. And so that was the genesis of this idea of just like, let's make the whole damn thing a surprise. And so this is an idea I've had poking around in my head. I'm probably going to do it in the next couple of years, where the entire thing is a surprise. You don't even know where you're going until you get to the airport. So I don't know how to pull
Oh,
that off. I would really love it if I could
yeah.
send people on a plane and they don't even know when they get on a plane where they're going. But that's a little bit hard to pull off unless I charter a plane.
You would need a
Yeah,
private plane for
yeah,
that
exactly.
without them
Yeah.
knowing.
So chartering international planes is a pricey endeavor.
Yeah. But hey, right? You
Doable,
never
very
know.
doable. Stay tuned.
Okay. So, how do you now measure success compared to when you were running Sacred Rides? Because you were growing and you were an investor. And so, I think a lot of people's measure of success is growth, ROI, like these things. And so, how do you compare a measure of success now?
I guess I'll set up this question by saying with my previous company, the metric of success was growth. I had set in 2016, I'd set a goal of I wanted to be in 150 countries by 2021. And we expanded rapidly in the span of 6 months. We expanded to 40 new countries. It was really just about growth, revenue growth, destination growth, whatever. And in hindsight, I realized like what a ridiculous goal. Like, I was so driven by my ego and recognition and wanting validation, all these kind of things. It wasn't really tied to anything meaningful. And when I decided to focus on Wayfinders full time, and in that sort of liminal space where I was creating these new events, I knew I wanted to sell Sacred Rides. I decided I wanted to take a very different approach to this company and to what I was doing. And it was really about how can I create value for people? How can I create lasting value for their lives? So how I measure success is in the stories that I hear back from people. And those could be stories about a friendship that has developed as a result of attending one event. And there's so many, right? We spend very intimate time together. And it is a context that creates as favorable conditions for friendship and connection as one can imagine. The other is just hearing stories of people moving towards authenticity, towards a life that feels good to them. And sometimes those stories aren't quite so heartwarming. There was a participant that joined my event in Ecuador, and she decided during that event, during a particular exercise, she finally came to the realization that her relationship no longer felt aligned. And that was the beginning at the end of that relationship. And that sounds a little bit sad and tragic. And there's grief and there's heartbreak and this it's a long-term relationship, but also feeling like this feels right for me. This was no longer working for either of us. And this is moving us closer towards alignment. And so if I can help somebody, whether it's finally accepting that a job or relationship or the place they live or whatever it is no longer feels aligned, and I can give them the courage to make that step, that feels very good to me. Even though in the short term it might mean making some very difficult decisions. So that to me is a metric of success, helping people live their own lives, their true lives.
Yeah, even if it means leaving a relationship or closing a business or whatever that might be. And I personally, after my first trip with you, and you recently heard me talk about this on stage, that, I had existential crisis after that trip to Greenland. I didn't lose my way, but I realized that something was out of alignment, and I had to spend some real time doing some deep soul searching. So it cracked something open, and while it was it was exactly what I needed, and it was the best thing that could have happened. And so I think the beauty in the adventures you take people on is when you don't necessarily know whatever that might be. And those difficult conversations or actions are the things that a lot of people don't actually do. And then they get stuck and nothing ever
Hmm.
changes.
Yeah, precisely. Part of my role, among many roles as facilitator, part of it is to help people identify that nagging itch that's maybe been existing below the surface for many years and they don't want to acknowledge it, and to just scratch at that a little bit until it becomes a little more painful. They're a little bit more aware, right? That sounds a little bit, strange to say or whatever, but we humans are very good at lying to ourselves and bullshitting ourselves. And we can, whether it's a relationship or a job or something else, we can exist at a 3 out of 10 happiness level. And it's not so critical that it's like keeping us awake at night or we're in crisis mode, but we're basically existing at a very low level of fulfillment, of happiness, or whatever. And we'll just continue that for years and years. And if I can just scratch that a little bit and make them aware of just how much that's costing them, right? Like, do you really want to be in a job that you hate for the next 10, 20 years? Do you really want to be in a relationship that no longer serves either of you? And often what keeps us in those things is fear. And so it's a two-sided thing of helping people just realize what they're giving up by continuing this, and then helping them develop a little bit of courage to finally address this. And the final part of it is like something I really want to put a lot of focus on over the next year. What is the support that we can offer after these adventures? It's a little bit tricky. People come home and they go back into their routines and their lives and whatever. And you can stand on a mountaintop in Greenland or in the deserts of Morocco, whatever, and you have all this clarity, like, oh my God, like this has to change. And then you come home and inertia takes over, fear takes over, and everything locks.
Real
Yeah,
life.
everything
No.
locks back up, and then it's easy to almost dismiss. Oh well, that was just like random hallucination in the desert. That's just like, the intellectual justification for continuing something that no longer works, right? And so that's the part where I really want to help support people when they come home, because the decision they may have made in the desert may be an extremely difficult one, and they need support for that. Not necessarily support from me, but from the people that they share that with. And I know that some of that happens by accident or without our intervention, but I want to support that some more.
Yeah, I think it's easy to get caught up in the safety and comfort of our lives. And I heard this line recently, that, easy life now equals a hard life
Mm-hmm.
later. And the hard life now equals an easy life later. Sort of like you do the hard thing now so that you can have the life you actually desire, versus taking the easy route and maybe not having the conversation and letting things go too long. And then you end up being miserable in the long term because you made what seemed to be the easy decision in the time.
Yeah. And related to that is this idea that the quality of your life is directly related to your willingness to have difficult conversations. And there are always difficult conversations to have. And too often we just let those conversations go by unspoken and we don't speak these things. And it's a bit of a muscle to develop, right? I know this from experience. Some of those difficult conversations they almost feel life or death. Internally, it feels like a psychological life or death to have these difficult conversations. But if I don't have them, then resentment builds, both for another person maybe or for myself or whatever. I've come to actually view this as a practice and a muscle that needs to be developed. And I'm always looking for little opportunities here and there to practice having difficult conversations, because it means I just over time develop the courage. And can I share a funny story with you?
Absolutely.
So about two,
Am I in?
you're not. It would be very weird if you were, and that it'll make sense in
Okay.
hindsight. This was about 3 years ago, 3 years ago, and I'd been ruminating on this idea of like, oh, there's so many conversations that I'm shying away from, and by shying away from them, I'm really compromising the quality of my life. And this is also tangential to this idea of boundaries. Whether it's in a intimate relationship, professional relationship, friend relationship, right? Boundaries, I've come to discover, are so important. And so I was journaling about this one morning, and then I was thinking, oh, I need to find little areas. There's some conversations I want to have that feel so threatening and overwhelming, and I need to work my way up to that, and I need to practice. So I said, I'm going to look for opportunities to practice, and just look for opportunities where I want to say something about something, and I'm pulling back. I'm a little bit too scared. So I go to my local YMCA, I go to my workout, and as was my routine, after every workout, I'd go into the sauna. Now, there's a sign outside the sauna that says, please sit on a towel. And every day, without fail, there's 5 or 6 guys in the sauna, and at least 2 or 3 of them are completely naked, just sitting on the bench. And it's just like so disgusting to me. Like they're just sweating down their butt crack onto the bench and like, ah. And I'm not a germaphobe, but I don't want to sit in somebody else's butt sweat. And so it's like, and I would always just go sit quietly and then just leave. And I was like, shit, I told myself I was going to practice. So it took me like 10 minutes to figure out how am I going to say this? There was just one guy in there at the time sitting naked and sweating all over the place. It took me 10 minutes to screw up the courage and figure out how I was going to say it. But finally I said, hey, can I ask you a favor? Could you just next time bring a towel so that you're not sweating all over the bench? And my whole body was kind of shaking at saying this. And then he just said, oh, yeah, you're totally right. No problem. It's like, oh, that was easy. And so I just share
Ah,
that story with you as an example of how we can look for little opportunities because I'd come to build up all this resentment that people were sitting there and it's kind of gross and whatever. And for me, resentment is always a clue that there's a conversation that needs to be had. When you feel resentment building, it's because you're unwilling to have a conversation or set a boundary. And over time, that resentment will just build and build, whether it's in a relationship or a
yeah.
professional setting or with a friend or whatever. And if you can get better and better at having these conversations, the quality of your life will improve.
I'm so glad it wasn't
If you
there
were
for
in that
that
sauna,
sweaty
it
butt
would have
crack
been quite
story.
surprising.
Whew. Yes, it would
Yeah.
have. And I am really practicing that, flexing that muscle. It's something in my journal that I'm willing to have the hard conversations. And I know you and I just had one of those yesterday, at least it was for
Hmm.
me. And I'm practicing that a lot more because I feel it in my whole body when,
And, goes for professional settings as well. Psychological safety is really just this idea that people can voice things at work and not be afraid of retribution. They can voice difficult things and they can have difficult
yeah,
conversations. I was coaching a guy probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and he was running a company of about 50 people. And he had described how the company culture had gotten really toxic. And he was sharing some of these stories about what was going on and all these resentments that were building. And I asked him, like, tell me about your relationship with conflict growing up. And he shared growing up for him, it was a chaotic household and he felt very little psychological safety. And so he was always walking on eggshells, pulling back, not wanting to voice what was going on. And so he learned at a very early age, it's like, don't voice your opinion because it's dangerous. And then, of course, that filters through an entire company. People learn, okay, if I'm resentful about something, I'm not going to voice it. I'm not going to voice it to my boss because he really doesn't like even an inkling of conflict and things get very difficult or awkward. So I'll just internalize all this stuff. And if you do that long enough and it spreads throughout an entire company, it just becomes a place riddled with resentment. And so I worked with him over the course of many months of helping him practice. And he had all these complaints about his staff and all this. And he said, well, all these things that are bothering you, do you ever voice them? No. Okay. So you're just going to let this continue forever? And it took time, but he got better at voicing these things and creating a culture that was more open and allowed these things to come forth. And so that when somebody can come to him, it's met with openness, it's met with appreciation. It's like, okay, let's have a conversation about this. And that's how you create psychological safety in the workplace or in any relationship. You make it safe for people to voice what's going on in their heart, what's going on in their soul, whatever that may be.
I think that psychological safety is absolutely key. So I think, this ties into that a lot because you've mentioned before this idea that the destructive role of the ego in an entrepreneur's life. And I know that's something you've talked about. And, I wanted to ask, can you share maybe a personal experience where managing your own ego was crucial to your growth? And I think we all have those moments where the ego takes over, but can you think of one that had a particular influence on, how you approach?
Well, I already touched on it, and I want to go a little. The shift that occurred from my approach from my previous company, I'd gotten to the point where the company was growing, 40, 50% a year, growing very rapidly. I'd done 3 rounds of investment, brought on investors, brought on a lot of debt, brought on a lot of staff, a lot of expansion. Seemingly, things were going great. I was a baller. And I'd set this crazy goal of being in 150 countries. And then I'd also set this goal that I didn't share with the staff that I wanted to be on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine. And in hindsight, these goals were just so ego driven. And 2 things happened that just woke me right up and kind of slapped some sense into me. Because it was along the way, it was a very unfulfilling journey. It was just super stressful. It didn't feel very fulfilling at all. And so 2 things happened. One, I read this book, Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. Every page was like a gut punch to my gut, to the soul, if you will. And I could see myself in those pages and just what I was doing And the second was a session at this conference called MMT by Philip McKernan. He works in a similar space as me, and he's very direct and confrontational with his approach, and really doesn't let people get away with bullshit. And so it was this session, I can't even remember, it was something around clarity was the name of the title. And one of the questions he asked in that session was, where are you seeking validation? And as I started reflecting on this and journaling about it, I realized two things. Everything I was doing in my company was this hungry quest for validation. And two, that it was in search of validation that I never got from my mom and dad. And it's not like my parents never validated me or never said they loved me or anything like that. It was just, I didn't get enough of it. They had their own busy lives to lead. They had their own struggles and problems. And it was those two things, it was like a light bulb going off, and this realization that I was never going to get what I was looking for by growing my company and seeking all these, I could very clearly look ahead to the day when we would hit our 150th country. And I was confident that we would do it. And we would pop a bottle of champagne, we would go out for dinner and celebrate with the staff or whatever. And then the next day it'd be like, okay, well, now what? And it would be hollow and meaningless. With the, cover of Entrepreneur magazine, maybe I would, maybe I would frame it on the wall and I'd look and be like, oh, way to go. And really it wouldn't ring true. And so that really informed my approach. Two things. One, I needed to seek that validation, self-love, worth, whatever that may be, and get it there rather than external factors. And two, my approach with my company was going to be about the people that not about me. Amazingly, that approach has led to far more abundance than I ever had with my previous company, and has led to more abundance on so many different by taking a service first approach towards my work rather than metrics, revenue growth, whatever that may be. So
yeah, a bigger business doesn't necessarily mean more for you. Sometimes it actually can mean less and more work.
Yeah, you've got that nice hockey stick going up, and then your expenses are an even steeper hockey stick. And you're like, what is going on here?
My bookkeeper years ago said she put out a questionnaire asking people if they would rather have a 7-figure business and make $200,000, a $300,000 business and make $200,000. And she's like, everybody said the $1 million business and earn 200,000 because of, I guess, the optics of like, oh, I have a 7-figure business. I've arrived. I'm part of this club, whatever that means. But she's like, you're earning the same amount of money and probably working that much harder for the same end result. That's an ego vision.
100%.
I wrote a blog post, I don't know if you remember it, after Greenland, and it was entitled something like more, better, and enough. And those words came up and for me, and it was like, those words are all so loaded. Enough. There's always that more and, and that searching for better. And it's like, at what point are you actually satisfied with where you are, as opposed to always striving for more and better?
Yeah, we had a rich discussion in Greenland about that. There's this story, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but I think if I understand it correctly, it's Joseph Heller who wrote Catch 2 and Kurt Vonnegut at a party, and I think Joseph Heller had a Pulitzer Prize, and Kurt Vonnegut was talking to somebody in the story, and all his accolades and all this kind of stuff, and Kurt Vonnegut said, "I have something that he'll never have." And the person said, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "Enough." I think for me, it's finding this balance of trying to always strive to have a feeling of enough. Where I am right now is totally enough. And I can still have goals and I can still want more. It's detaching from the expectation of achieving these things. And part of it for me, it's not so much the goal itself, it's who do I become in the process of striving for these goals and achieving these goals. And we chatted about this, I think, the other night. Mount Cotopaxi. I took a group to Ecuador to climb Mount Cotopaxi, which is a volcano that's just under 20,000 feet. It's a pretty big endeavor. To be able to stand on that summit. And I trained for 4 months with our friend Alan leading up to that, and focus on my sleep and nutrition, whatever. By the time I got to Cotopaxi, I was in the best shape of my life. And I met on that summit, and it was nice and all, but it really wasn't about the summit. It was about the process of getting there and what it did for just who I became in the process. And now I've set bigger goals in terms of my mountaineering, and not, standing on a summit, it's a temporary thing and it feels good for a few minutes, but it's like, who do I have to become in order to become the type of person who can stand on top of a 20 or 25,000 foot mountain?
100%.
I love being in mountains. They're such a spiritual home for me. How do I approach this mountain with reverence? How do I enter into communion with this mountain and the spirits that are there and whatever? And as you know, like I've set this crazy goal for 2029. And this particular goal, I'm not going to say too much about it, but this particular goal can be extremely ego driven, and a lot of people approach it from that perspective. But I'm trying to get to the point where I'm checking my ego and it's like, is my ego at play here? Like, why do I want to stand on top of this? But this is sort of the ultimate challenge. And who do I have to become along the way to get it? And how can I approach that whole pursuit from a standpoint of it not being about me, but how can I be in service and who along the way? So it's an ongoing tension. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the journey is not, it's cliche, but it's not about the end destination, right? That's, buried 6 feet under. So who are we and what are we doing along the journey that makes up all of the stories? And you're living a life rich with stories and adventures, and you're always creating new ones. And I think there's a beauty in what you've created for yourself. I think, somebody like you should be speaking in schools, showing kids, right? That's, buried 6 feet under. So who are we and what are we doing along the journey that makes up all of the story? And you're living a life rich with you're always creating new ones. And I think there's a beauty in what you've created yourself. I think, somebody like you should be speaking in schools, showing kids that, hey, there's another option to a career path that isn't necessarily what you might think, right? It's not their, kind of engineer, because a lot of kids don't fit the typical model of what school is trying to fit into that box. And, if young people could see, you mean I could go climb mountains and go have these adventures and run a business doing that, okay, that's interesting.
Well, it's funny you should say that because my eldest daughter is taking an class this year, grade 11. And so I told her, ask your teacher if she wants somebody to come in and talk about a fairly unconventional trajectory into entrepreneurship. And the other thing I wanted to say is you were speaking about this idea of the journey. To me, one of the most important things is who am I walking that journey with, right?
Yep.
And we all know like the science of happiness. Every data points to relationships and the people we spend our time with being the number one predictor of happiness, longevity, health, well-being, all that kind of stuff. That is what I orient my life around. That is first and foremost as I plan out my life, my calendar, my goals, all these kind of things. A goal to me is meaningless if I'm doing it alone. It's just so much more rich and rewarding if there's people on the journey with me, either supporting me or going on the same journey, or I'm supporting them or what. Ultimately, that's what makes life worthwhile.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. And I love that I get to be on some of those journeys with you.
And that's taken many forms, right? Journeys to other countries, dinners, podcasts, and it's beautiful. I'm so grateful we get this time together.
So I want to ask you one question before we, let people know how they can find out about joining Wayfinders and one of your adventures. But what advice would you give to founders who are looking to create their legacy brand in a way that aligns with their personal values, passions, and, especially if they're in that time of transition, like maybe thinking of getting a business or kind of realizing that they are no longer in alignment with the business that they've built?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really starts with just knowing yourself. But that's a tough journey. Like know your, like that's such a process, peeling back an onion, and every layer of that onion, it's somebody along the way told you who you are, who you shouldn't be, who you should be, where you should go to school, who you hang out with, parents, teachers, friends, whatever. The more I delve into this world of psychology and personal growth, the more how little to kind of throw you off course. All it takes is you love singing, and then one day you're singing, and somebody says, "Oh, stick to your day job." Let's say you're 10 years old. That's like a sword through the. And then this beautiful thing that you just shut that down. You may never find that again, or maybe you find it 30 years later. After some painful work. So it's a lot of work to like, what's at the core of me? Like, what is it that really makes my heart sing, makes my soul? There's so many ways that into that idea of the true authentic self, the soul. I can share, for me, journaling is an incredible practice. Meditation, breath work, psychedelics, therapy, dialogue with friends. It's really the starting point is getting curious about yourself and with humility saying, I actually don't really know who I am. I wonder what's at the core of me. Who's in there? And just accepting that as a valuable question, because it's so easy, in this world of entrepreneurship, there's such a dominant narrative of what it looks like to be a successful entrepreneur. And so many people I know who have followed that conventional, I'm going to scale, I'm going to bring on VC money, I'm going to build a big team, all this kind of stuff are either miserable or that it doesn't really feel aligned. And I can say that like being able to show up every day and do work that feels align that feels like an expression of you at your core is one of the most beautiful things in the world. And I'm so grateful I get to inhabit that space. And so start with that as a starting, but say to, particularly if you're in transition and you're just like, I have no idea, I don't know what, that can feel like a really overwhelming process and overwhelming journey. And so many people get like in their heads about it. It's like, I have to find my life purpose. When you start from that perspective, it can become overwhelming and paralyzing, right? And it's sort of akin to dating. It's like, I have to find my soulmate. I have to find that perfect person. We know the perfect person doesn't exist. It's work. It's work to create a, relation. I tell people, just run some experiments. What is the tiniest experiment you can run? You know, if you think, oh, well, there was a time in my life where I really loved singing. What happened to that? What's one tiny experiment? Like, I'm going to sign up and I'm going to join my local community choir. Let's see what happens if I do that. How do I feel when I show up to this community choir? If I come alive, well, maybe that's a good clue. That doesn't have to become a career. You don't have to become one of the three tenors. But just going, once a week to this choir and lighting yourself up, it's probably going to have ripple effects into the rest of your life. So get to know yourself and run some experiments.
And I think it's often the thing that comes easiest to us that is sort of that it's like staring people right in the face, but they can't see it because they're like, oh, but isn't this something everybody's good at or loves to do? And they don't actually realize that that's probably because but it's almost too easy. A quick story. And I think it was a Wayfinders event and I'm traveling, I'm away from my family and I'm feeling this like guilt of like talking about going on these adventures because it feels self-serving. It's like, oh, you're leaving your family behind and you're doing this and that. And I've started doing more of that and connecting. And I realize these trips I go on, whether it's I get to connect with people and build my business through connections and deep conversations and no pitching and no selling and nothing, just deep, meaningful relationships that doesn't require a funnel, a single lead magnet on my website anymore. It works for some people. It was so out of alignment for me. And I made a declaration publicly a year or so ago. I'm like, I'm done with funnels. Like, I'm done with funnels. That's not how I want to build my business. And I realized that me just being out there, connecting with people, helping them in conversation and whatever was actually organically growing my business far beyond any other activity I did because it's easy for me. And I get to have a hell of a lot of fun doing it. And so I'm like, why should I feel guilty because I get to grow my business and be in my business in a way that truly aligns with me and allows me to show up at my best for everybody. So I definitely got over that.
I love that. And you're so right. Sometimes it's just staring us in the face and we don't want to accept it, or we want to, it's harder than that. Like, it's got to be this big epic journey to get there, or whatever. It's like, no, sometimes the answer's right there in plain view.
In plain view. Mike, I think we could talk forever. And tips and insights and stories, I think, will help so many people. So thank you for sharing all of those things. How can people connect with you? How can they join the Wayfinders community or find out about adventures, which I think are pretty much sold out for at least the next year? But get on his waiting list. That's how I got a last minute trip to Greenland and it changed my life. So whatever you do, his Substack, follow his email list. Maybe you don't even need to say anything now, Mike.
Way-finders. That's the website. Yeah, I am sold out for the next year. On the adventures, I'm putting a lot of focus over the coming months into the community membership, and that's sort of another way into the community aside from the adventures. And so I'm bringing on some new people to help, and we're really trying to expand the value that we offer through the community membership, both for people in Toronto and elsewhere. So if you go to wayfinders.com and click on membership, we're actually and you can apply through there. And we're actually doing like a bit of a fall promotion where you can get half price off your first year of membership and you can sort of kick the tires a little bit. And we've got some really exciting stuff coming up that I'm not going to share with you right now because it's in the works, but it's exciting.
Because Mike likes secrets. Can't give it all away.
Surprises.
We'll make sure to, surprises, not secrets. Two different things. And I will definitely put the link to that page in the show notes as well. And if anybody, I feel like I'm a salesperson for you. So if anybody wants to talk, you know where to find me as well. Thank you so much, Mike, for being here. And I'm looking forward to learning how to scuba dive together for our trip to Papua New Guinea next year.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks for tuning into the Legacy Branding Podcast. I hope today's episode has inspired and empowered you on your journey to building a brand that truly matters. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other founders who you think would benefit from listening. And if you're ready to take the next step in building your legacy brand, visit our website, labcreative.ca, to learn more and book a call. Don't forget to join us next time for more conversations that will help you navigate your transition and create your legacy. Until then, I'm Laura Beauparlant.